the next step is to go ahead and remove the starter itself. I'm sure I could just remove this spring and leave this bracket in place, but there's no sense in, it's just almost an immeasurable amount of weight, but there's just no sense in leaving any components of a removed system. So I'll take the extra second and remove it. In my opinion, that's probably the legal thing to do, is to remove all the bracketry. In my opinion, but there's no sense in getting into that discussion at this point. I have the battery disconnected in the baggage compartment. So this high tension lead coming up from the battery, even though the master switch is off and the constant duty contactor master switch solenoid is not engaged, by having that battery disconnected just gives me a little bit of safety margin. Okay, if you can see this, there's three connectors here. One is the high tension lead coming from the master switch relay or the battery up to the starter. The other one is coming up from the alternator to the starter, which is just using this lug as a binding post. Basically, we can consider this the charge cable coming from the alternator. So it's using this lug as a binding post to connect the alternator charge cable to the high tension lead going back to the battery. And then the third one goes to the main bus bar in the dash. One of the neat things about working on this airplane, this machine was built, I think this is a 46 model, if I remember correctly, 1946. This machine was built, I guess there was a surplus of craftsmen, sheet metal craftsmen from World War II that were still in the industry. And unlike a production built aircraft, this one was more built by hand, even though it may have been assembled on an assembly line. Just the craftsmanship and the bodywork, the sheet metal assembly, it's just very impressive. It's a completely different level than your modern aircraft. Not saying there's anything wrong with modern aircraft at all, but when you look at the craftsmanship of these, it's not even on the same level. These are by far superior. All right, if I tear this gasket a little bit, I'm not really concerned about it because they gave me a new one in the kit. Let's try to wiggle this out of here without scratching up the engine mount. Look at that, it came out nicely. I got the old starter over here on the bench, and normally I would weigh the old starter and the cable and weigh the new starter, and I try to get the weight and balance as closely as I could in calculated form. But this aircraft, we refinished the whole fuselage, stripped all the paint off, finished it. So I'm not going to worry about how much this starter weighed, because we're going to redo the weight and balance in its entirety and actually weigh the aircraft. So how much I took off and how much I put back on, it's kind of irrelevant, since I'm going to be doing actually physically weighing the aircraft instead of doing a calculated weight and balance, if that makes sense. All right, I'll have to resituate the camera, but there's a shaft in here. I believe it's what would you call that shaft? I guess it'd be called like an idle shaft, an idler shaft. It's basically a mandrel that the starter gear slides on. to engage and disengage. That shaft has to be shortened up to make clearance for the new starter. So I'll have to resituate the camera and get that set up. Hopefully I can get the camera set up to where it doesn't interfere with me coming in here, marking the shaft and cutting the shaft and modifying the shaft. Now this engine's got about 800 hours on it, so there's no need to take the engine apart, but an alternative means of compliance for cutting the shaft off, the paperwork says that overhaul, just simply pull that shaft out of the engine altogether and eliminate it. So obviously we're not going to do that with a mid-time engine, but once this engine comes down for any kind of work at all, we'll simply remove that shaft. This is a fairly hard angle to record. This is the shaft, this idle shaft. This is the shaft that we got to cut back. And it says that the directions, they want a minimum depth of 2.6 inches from this flange. So we'll set up, we'll get a mark, get it measured, and we'll go from there. Now, 2.7 is almost back to the plus for the case. Get set up again. I see some metal going down there towards the alternator, so let me get a cover that up. Okay, this is the shaft cut off. She ended up having to do a lot of the work here in this mirror to keep me on track. Let's see if we can get a good picture inside. The shaft's cut off, and we gently cleaned up, deburred the edges of the shaft. We're ready to move on to the next step. This original starter, I don't have a scale here right handy, but the difference in weight is considerable. This thing is extremely light. Alright, I've already cleaned this up, but I want to show you what I've done here. Before I removed the tray, I got the camera set up to where you can see in there. I can't quite see the same time you're seeing in there, so you have to bear with me. But I got a chainsaw file that I cut the end of it off. So I have filing material right to the edge. And I very carefully went around here, put in a chamfer on the stub that's left. All the way around, so there's no chance of a burr or any materials falling down into the crankcase. Well, that was a nice install. Okay, the new lightweight starter is on and torqued. The binding posts for the wiring connections are on this side of the starter now. The old starter, they were over on this side. So, you might be able to see this wire here in the picture. So here's the wires. I'm going to have to strap these up and get them routed over to this side. And then the wires, the new wires that we put in for our push button are right here. I'll get them strapped up and routed over to this side too. I'll reposition the camera so you can see the connections. So far, the installation's been going fairly well. As you can see, this is a pretty nice unit. I have run into my first stumbling block. You can see down here on this binding post. See if the camera will focus in on that. Oh yeah, there we go. You can see with all these old terminal ends just simply transferred to this side, I don't have enough. The binding post itself is not long enough on the starter. Well, trying to come up with a solution to all these terminations being on the binding post of this new starter. And I called the factory tech support to discuss a few options. Now I'm down to two choices. The first one is to put a lug here, like a copper lug, if you will, a terminal block right off this stud. The second choice, which I've elected to do, is to go back with the starter relay that Sky-Tec sells. That'll put a jumper wire back between these two contactors, these two lugs, and it'll mount a start relay on the firewall somewhere. And then these wires can be bindered to a larger, longer binding post on the start relay. Now, in looking at these wires, I found another problem that I don't like. This wire here with the yellow terminal end crimped onto it is a heavy gauge wire, probably, I would guess probably a number 4 gauge wire, and it goes around one piece right down to the alternator. It's the charge cable. One thing that caught my eye on this is that, in my opinion, there should be a fuse or a breaker off the charge cable in line somewhere. There's not. It comes right off the alternator right to the starter. Now, interesting enough, I'll put a picture of this in here. I'll see if you can see this. I pulled up an old wiring schematic that I have in a Cessna book, and it calls it out right here that on serial numbers, blah, 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 that the 35 amp fuse on the old generator system was optional. And right here it shows it in highlight. I drew it in there with my pencil. But on some of these older models, they didn't have a fuse, any kind of circuit protection. However, that was on the old generator, and when it was a 35 amp generator. This has since been changed to a Zeftronic system with an alternator and I guess it's a VCU, a voltage control unit. So that prompted me to look up the paperwork that did this install, and again, I'll post a picture of that. Here's some of my scribbles, but long and the short of it, in the installation drawings and the directions for the new alternator upgrade, it clearly calls for a 60 amp breaker to be installed in the system. So with that said, I'm going to run a new charge cable. When we mount the start relay, I want to run a new charge cable. I will put a fuse in it somewhere. We'll probably put a external fuse out here in the engine compartment. I haven't come up with that yet, but we're going to put an inline fuse of some sort in the charge cable. So we'll be able to, by addressing all these connections on this one little binding post, we'll be able to fix another problem that we didn't know we had yet, because we haven't gotten to that part, or we haven't found it on the inspection yet that didn't have a fuse. All right, that's it for now. When I come up with a game plan for the start relay, I think I want to use these 2 existing holes, I believe, but when I come up with a game plan, I'll set the camera back up and we'll get that recording. About to go home for the day, and we received a bag from a well-known aircraft supply shop. Just call it that. Got the wire we need. Whole assortment. Terminal ends. And the 60 amp breaker that we need. Awesome. In addition, we have a, well, this says Lamar, but it's supposed to be a Sky-Tec. I guess it's the same thing. STC, PMA, blah, blah, blah. All right. So they had 2 of these starters, probably identical, came off the same assembly line, I'm sure. But the one was $18, and this one was $83. Yeah, it looks identical to the other one, except we have all the proper nomenclature that we need, and a little packet of paperwork to make it official. Okay, the installation of the Sky-Tec starter is complete. You can see we went with a starter relay. Takes a little bit of time, but I'm rather pleased with it. It's a pretty nice setup. Here we are in the interior of the 140. Check to make sure that I don't have any fuel in the carburetor, and the mags are definitely grounded. But I do want to check the starter, try it. Make sure the mixture is idle cutoff. Energize the master. And I don't have a prop on the engine, so at all costs I don't want to start it. I just want to bump the starter, engage it, and let off. So here we go. Works like a charm. Perfect. There you have it.